The Climate and Food Insecurity Index shown here is a measure of how vulnerable countries' food security system is to the negative impacts of weather and climate. The most developed countries, countries that are very small, and those with little or no domestic production have been excluded from the calculation. Here the index is shown for the remaining countries for the present day. The index shows the highest levels of vulnerability to food insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa, medium levels across much of Asia, and lower levels in South and Central America. The present-day values are a baseline from which to compare how action to address greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to climate change could affect the scale and geography of future vulnerability to food security relative to today. In the first scenario, we consider the effect of rapid and sustained reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions, but we don't include any adaptation in the scenario, so we're only looking at the future impact of climate change on vulnerability to food insecurity. In this scenario, we see that by the 2050s, vulnerability to food insecurity has increased compared to the present day. This shows us that even with rapid and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, we will still experience some climate change in the next few decades, with negative consequences for food security. However, looking out to the 2080s, we see that the situation remains stable. Vulnerability to food insecurity is still higher than the present day, but no higher than it was in the 2050s. In this next scenario, we consider the effect of considerable increases in future global greenhouse gas emissions. But like the previous scenario, we don't include any adaptation, so we are only looking at the impact of climate change. In this scenario, we see that by the 2050s, vulnerability to food insecurity has increased compared to the present day. The increase is larger than the increases seen in the previous lower emissions scenario. By the 2080s, we see that the vulnerability to food insecurity has continued to increase considerably, both compared with the present day and compared with the 2050s. We can also consider another scenario of rapid and sustained reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions, but this time include in the scenario higher levels of adaptation to climate change. Under this scenario, we see that by the 2050s, the vulnerability of countries to food insecurity is at similar levels to the present day. This indicates that adaptation has kept pace with climate change. Then by the 2080s, as the climate stabilises but adaptation continues, vulnerability to food insecurity reduces. In this scenario, adaptation overtakes climate change, and the 2080s see improvements over both the 2050s and the present day. Finally, we consider the effect of considerable increases in future global greenhouse gas emissions, and this time include in the scenario high levels of adaptation to climate change. Under this scenario, we see that by the 2050s, the vulnerability of countries to food insecurity is somewhat worse than the present day. Under a scenario of increasing greenhouse gas emissions, the level of climate change by the 2050s is such that the adaptation in the scenario does not quite keep pace. By the 2080s, we can see that the vulnerability to food insecurity has increased further. Climate change impacts are greater than the effect of adaptation. However, adaptation has had a positive impact, as this scenario shows a better outcome than the scenario with the same global emissions, but with no adaptation included. The future scenarios for the Climate and Food Insecurity Index show us that climate change alone will have a negative impact on vulnerability to food insecurity, and that the impact will be greatest under the highest greenhouse gas emissions scenarios. It also shows that adaptation will help to counteract this negative trend. Adaptation may not be able to offset all the impacts of climate change under the highest emissions scenario, but it does improve the situation. And in the lowest emissions scenario, by both adapting and mitigating, we can have a positive impact on long-term food security.